up, we'll have Chris and Tamara. Chris Stoney is Associate Professor in the School of Public Policy and Administration at Carleton University, where he teaches MA courses on federal and local government, public sector management, organizational theory, strategy, and urban sustainability. His current research includes the use of community engagement in neighborhood urban planning and issues of emergency management and preparedness. He also writes on intergovernmental relations and various aspects of Canadian public policy, such as regulation, procurement, and accountability. His co-presenter, Tamara Krawchenko, is a PhD student in public policy and political economy at Carleton University. Her doctoral research focuses on the construction of regional political spaces, emerging institutional forms, and the resultant implications for urban and regional governance.
Thank you, Carlo. I'm so pleased to be invited to this conference where there was the work of so many people that I greatly admire. This conference also came at a very good time for Chris and I. We live in Ottawa, and the narrative of Canadian exceptionalism is very strong in the city. Yet at the same time, there's a palatable fear about the direction of change in the public sector, and many of my friends who are public servants have been laid off. So while there's a very strong control of information and getting bits and pieces of an idea of the direction of where we're headed in terms of austerity in advance of the budget. And so we took the opportunity to come here to look at some of the numbers, which I hadn't done before. So an overarching thing that we're looking at is that with crisis comes uncertainty, and with it opportunity. And what direction does that opportunity take? When the crisis hit in late 2008, I took some glee in the self-reflection that was happening within the dominant economic journals. The Economist, for instance, briefly declared the death of neoclassical economics, which I was very intrigued to see. But then they rectified it and defended it in its subsequent issue. So it was a very short bout of soul-searching there. Leading up to the crisis, there was a movement within economics to question the sort of market fundamentalist logic that had predominated, and the increasingly divorced from reality mathematical models that had given so much influence, have been given so much influence in public policy. So some of the journal articles and books from the late 90s and the early 2000s bore such titles as Debunking Modern Economic Thought, The Death of Economics, Against Economics, The End of Economics, Growth Fetish, The Growth Illusion, Where on Earth Are We Going? A Guide to What's Wrong. And so when the crisis hit, I thought, wow, you know, this is going to be a rethink. We're going to really see a different direction. It's very idealistic, of course. And I was particularly interested in what the direction governments like the Harper government would take. I thought that neoclassical economics and its bedfellow neoliberalism had come to dominate so long that its critique would lead many to ask, are we witnessing a paradigm shift in thinking? What will replace the dominance of this thought? As governments have to adopt massive stimulus measures, are we seeing a shift in public expenditures and public policy away from market fundamentalism? And I think in Canada we can answer those questions with a resounding no. And in fact, the narrative of stimulus to austerity has been quite consistent in its thinking about, in its approach. So we focus on telling the narrative of stimulus and austerity by looking at federal government expenditures from 2006 onwards using public accounts data. I really wanted myself to get an understanding of sort of the overarching trends that we're seeing, and I wanted to delve in to look at the data that we could use to analyze this. And I actually found the data that I could find rather disappointing. One of the things that I thought might be of use was that the federal government has created an open data portal as part of their open policy development initiatives, or open government initiatives. And the data there was distinctly not useful for the type of political financial analysis that I wanted to do. So instead we relied on public accounts data by ministry, and that's the handout that we've given to you. And with all descriptive statistics, these come with the usual qualifiers that they only tell a part of a story. But they do give us some idea of the winners and losers. And the winners, the very clear winners that we have here are the two ministries. They're the Ministry of Transport and the Ministry of Natural Resources. And while that's consistent, I think, with what we might expect from this government, I was surprised by the extent to which they have grown in terms of public expenditures, which shows how much of a policy priority they are. Of course, within the Ministry of Transport, the major department there is Infrastructure Canada, so that was stimulus-led spending, and natural resources got much more of the climate change file from around 2008 onwards. They won that over from Environment Canada. Apparently there was an internal struggle. I think that when we look at Canada's stimulus response to the economic crisis, we can see that it's been consistent with Harper government's overall approach of open federalism, the two major tenets of which are smaller government, keeping the government's spending powers within boundaries, and adherence to the constitutional divisions of powers for the most part. There are exceptions, of course. The initial rounds of stimulus, there were two. There was the more financial stimulus and then the infrastructure stimuluses. Much of the stimulus, most of it, focused on tax cuts. And then there was the infrastructure stimulus spending, which required a lot of investment by other levels of government. Compared to other countries, the size of Canada's stimulus was relatively small. And the focus on reduced taxation was used to stimulate investment and ease the financial burden of certain groups, but it has been criticized distinctly for its lack of effectiveness and equity. Many of the tax cuts were corporate tax cuts. A lot of the tax incentives that were created would have benefited middle class and upper class homeowners more than others. And there was a distinct opportunism in the way that they structured the stimulus. Minister Flaherty distinctly said that these are going to be permanent from the onset. So they were never meant to have do sort of a short-term sparking of aggregate demand through spending measures. And much of that wasn't spending measures, it was a decreasing taxation. So by doing that, they have decreased the size of government revenue, and therefore, while GDP has declined and that has contributed to it, we can see that this is intentional and that it's a choice. And because of this, we find ourselves within the narrative of a large deficit and therefore austerity spending. And Chris is going to come and talk about the politics of that within different departments.
Okay, thanks, Tamara. I should just, you just sparked my memory of a conversation the other evening about, we were talking about paradigm shifts and whether we would have witnessed one, and I think we'd perhaps hoped somewhat naively for one, and rather than a paradigm shift, I think what we've actually seen is a pantomime shift. That seems to be more apt. But Tamara's absolutely right. This is coming at a good time, and you know, others are obviously focusing on the broader, globalized view here. We wanted to dig down a little bit more into the Canadian specific, and in particular the federal government, and that in part is reflected by the fact that we're working on Chapter 1, the introduction to how Ottawa spends. So these things are always at the top of our thinking around this time of year. A couple of things that I just wanted to look at was really the process and the politics, and some of the things that I think we might want to look out for in next week's budget. The first thing I would say that I found it more difficult than previous years to write about what's coming up I'm trying to anticipate what's coming up in the budget. We're getting very mixed messages. You know, Mr. Flaherty speaks with forked tongue, as does the rest of the government. As one commentator put it this week, we're getting mixed signals and Mr. Flaherty's leading as a merry dance. And I think there are reasons for that which will emerge. I think Jim touched on it this morning. It's really the precarious nature of the recovery that I think is having to be balanced with the political damage of further cuts and also the economic damage. But a couple of things that I just wanted to really touch on was, first of all, not to lose sight of the fact, and Jim again alluded to this, but I think it can be driven home. The current deficit, yes, we all know about the global crisis, but it's very much could also be seen as a manufactured crisis, and we say that because of specifically the decision, of course, to cut GST 2%, which, depending on which economist you listen to, has cost between 9 and 16 billion over the years that it's being cut. We've also had the decision to essentially reduce the debt in an artificial time frame, which just happens to be the election cycle. And I think very much the crisis has been used as part of the narrative in order to attack some significant perceived enemies of the current government, and to cut, in particular, the public servants. It's very interesting that under Mr. Harper's regime, the public service, the federal public service, has actually increased by about 30,000. But here we are now, quite publicly hearing, I think, our public servants being castigated as lazy, bloated, essentially all those kinds of words that redundant that you can think of. And I think this demonization of our public servants is obviously setting us up for cuts there. But you're also seeing it in other ways. They're taking the blame for ministers and for decisions. They're being, really hung out to dry publicly. And I think it's kind of disgraceful when you see public servants being used by, for example, Mr. Mackay, to dig up dirt on people who criticised his use of helicopters. That's obviously not the role of civil servants. And yet we're seeing that kind of I think, every day we hear that in Ottawa, that there is this breakdown, this politicization, almost an American model now, of public servants. That aside, I think it's also important to recognize some of the priorities and the strategies that are being used as we see it. Let me begin with what one commentator has described as strategy by stealth. This is very interesting. This is really, if you look at the countries, Greece or Ireland or even in Montreal this week, where cuts or increased fees are being announced, it obviously galvanizes opposition. And I think one of the tactics that Mr. Flaherty is using is to try and make cuts in a sense that are not absolute. Well, they are absolute, but they are essentially, Jim talked about the fact that we've got a big population growth and obviously inflation, which means there has to be, to stand still, there has to be a significant amount of increase in funding. And what he's doing and what he has been doing is increasing the funds, so there's no negative signs there, but actually the relative amount is decreasing. So it's usually kept within that bracket. For example, it was calculated that this year or last year, 4.6 billion was saved. Also, he's tending to target very small programs, and as he would say, there's hundreds of these programs that really we don't need. Of course, these are often the kinds of programs that really affect communities or women's groups or minorities or settlement programs, and I think those they are particularly vulnerable. The other thing that you obviously I think would be aware of, but should be aware of, is that they're targeting program expenses and not services. So that's really trying to bring the savings down by 80 out of 80 billion out of a total of 250 billion. Again, that fits with the narrative of a bloated, lazy, bureaucratic workforce. If you're going to try and carve out the efficiencies, shall we say, through strategic review and the deficit reduction action plan. I can't get my head around this one, but Veteran Affairs is doing very badly at the moment. I didn't expect that. they've lost, out of 4,000, they've lost about 1,500 of their staff already, and there's another 500 being predicted. Some of that is the demographics. Obviously, a lot of our veterans are passing away. But there's, I think the issue becomes, at what point does a cut to civil servants de facto become a cut in service? The veterans are already complaining that it's taking over a year for them to get their funding, their benefits that are entitled to them, and with further cuts that will obviously increase. They also complain about the fact that it used to take 2 minutes to answer the phone, now it's 10 minutes. These are obviously service issues, so I think it's an artificial separation of those two things. The other thing, more globally, I think the government is trying, as Jim suggested, to grow out of recession. I think that's based on our natural resources. Obviously, Mr. Harper's jettisoning of principles around China seem to have, don't let those get in the way of doing more trade with China, and obviously the Keystone Pipeline, you know, with the traditional US market as well. And obviously our natural resources. Interestingly, the natural resources, which have done well, it's very interesting that, you know, this is clearly an ideological issue, but I had a look this week, the National Post, an article by Terence Cochrane. I don't know if you've seen, he has a piece called The Chopping Block, where he puts forward things that could be chopped. And I looked down the list, he said, you know, Natural Resources Canada. I thought, well, that's interesting, since it's one of the growth areas. These are the areas that he wants cutting. The Clean Energy Fund Program, Eco Energy Program for Biofuels, Eco Energy Program for Renewable Power, Wind Power Production Incentive, Investments in Forest Industry Transformation Program, Eco Energy Innovation Initiative, Grant to Canada Foundation for Sustainable Development Technology, Biofuels Grant to the Foundation for Sustainable Development Technology. These are all the areas that Jim was talking about this morning that we need to put our efforts and resources into. That's not a selective list, that is the list that he put in there. Obviously no mention at all of the, you know, the oil-related natural resources that we're exploiting out west and so on. So I think that's, you know, obviously digging a little deeper behind the story. I'm going to be very quick now because I think we're taking up enough time. But I think the other issue that we should look at is how this sits, the strategic review program, against the Liberal efforts in the mid-1990s. Interestingly, the 1990s were a lot more severe in terms of the time frames that they had. They were really quite draconian, with some huge cuts in some areas, up to 50%. As you know, you lived through it. But I think it has to be kept in context what it is that this government is doing. It's actually a much slower pace than the Liberal government resorted to back in the 90s. Back then, the civil service shrank by 14%. That was 45,000 jobs. But there are some important differences. They were able to, or did, privatize Crown corporations, for example, and they slashed subsidies as well. They were very lucky in the sense that the US economy did pick up. There's really no sign that that's happening yet, and obviously that takes in a lot of Canadian goods and exports. Inflation remained low and in fact tumbled through that period to help investment and the recovery. That again is low now, but doesn't seem to be encouraging investment. So I think the other aspect there is, you know, we don't have the private sector flourishing in the way that it did. Certainly in Ottawa, which picked up a lot of the slack, the Nortels of this world, the Newbridges, provided about 70,000 jobs. So many of the public servants, you know, had opportunities. Whereas I think this time we won't see that to the same extent. So those are really the issues that we wanted to focus on, and we're just trying to dig a little bit deeper. Some of this will emerge a little bit more clear in terms of trends next week, but I think one of the questions we will be asking is what's strategic about strategic review, because I think that remains at the moment unclear. Okay, thank you very much.